The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream paper, elegant script, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly groceries. Inside, nestled between tissue paper, was a card that read, "The honor of your presence is requested at the marriage of Victoria Catherine Brennan to Marcus James Holbrook, my sister's wedding." 8 years of silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I held it in my hands like evidence in a case I'd rather not try. The return address was my childhood home in Westchester County, New York. The same colonial house where I'd spent my teenage years arguing with my father about everything from curfew to career choices. The same house where I'd been told I was throwing my life away when I announced I was going to law school instead of joining the family construction business. Judge Alexander Brennan. That's what the nameplate on my desk reads now. Federal District Judge for the Southern District of New York, at 34. I was the youngest person ever appointed to the position. But to my family, I was still just the disappointment who chose books over bulldozers. The last time I'd seen my father, Thomas Brennan, was at my swearing-in ceremony 6 months ago. He'd stood in the back of the courthouse, arms crossed, wearing his best suit that still smelled faintly of sawdust. He didn't clap when Chief Justice Martinez administered the oath. He didn't smile when photographers captured the moment. Just watched, stone-faced, as if he were witnessing a funeral rather than a celebration. Afterward, he'd approach me in the courthouse hallway. "You got what you wanted," he'd said, his voice rough with something I couldn't quite name. Hope! It was worth it. Then he'd walked away, leaving me standing there in my judicial robes, feeling smaller than I had in years. Now, 8 months later, here was this invitation. No personal note, no "we miss you" or "hope you can make it." Ain't just my name written. In Victoria's careful handwriting, the Honorable Judge Alexander Brennan. Even in inviting me, she'd managed to make it feel like a formality. I set the invitation on my mahogany desk and stared out the window of my chambers on the 23rd floor of the federal courthouse. Manhattan stretched out below me, a maze of steel and glass and ambition. People always said the city was unforgiving, but I'd found more acceptance in these concrete canyons than I'd ever found in the suburbs where I grew up. My clerk, Jennifer Walsh, knocked and entered without waiting. For permission. She had that particular look that meant she'd been monitoring my mood again. "Everything okay? You've been staring at that invitation for 10 minutes? Family wedding?" I said, not looking away from the window. "Ah," she sat down in the chair. "Across from my desk, the sister you never talk about? The one and only?" Jennifer had been with me since I was a junior associate at Morrison & Associates. She'd followed me through 3 job changes, 2 judicial clerkships, and finally here to the federal bench. She knew my history better than most therapists would. "Are you going?" she asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding for 3 days. Victoria was my only sibling. We'd been close once, before the family schism that had split us down the middle. She'd been the bridge between my father's old-world values and my new-world ambitions. But even bridges can burn. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's complicated. Family. Always is." The truth was more complex than that. My father hadn't just disapproved of my career choice. He'd actively worked against it. When I'd applied to Columbia Law School, he'd refused to co-sign my student loans. When I graduated summa cum laude, he skipped the ceremony. When I'd been offered a prestigious clerkship with Justice Rodriguez, he'd told the extended family I was playing dress-up in a courtroom instead of doing honest work. The breaking point had come during my confirmation hearings for the federal bench. Someone had leaked old college photos of me at anti-war protests, trying to paint me as some kind of radical activist. The photos were harmless. I'd been studying constitutional law, not planning revolution, but the media had run with the story. During the worst of it, when conservative pundits were questioning my fitness for the bench, my father had given an interview to the local newspaper. "I don't know what happened to my son," he'd said. "He used to be a good kid. Now he's too good for honest work, too good for his family. Maybe he's too good for the bench, too." The confirmation had gone through anyway. The Senate had seen through the manufactured controversy, recognizing it for what it was, political theater. But my father's words had cut deeper than any senator's questions. He'd chosen public humiliation over private conversation. He'd chosen his image over his son. Victoria had tried to play mediator, as she always did. She'd called me after the newspaper article, crying on the phone. "You know he didn't mean it," she'd said. "He's just hurt. He doesn't understand what you do." But I was done making excuses for him. A man who builds houses for a living should understand the concept of a foundation. You don't tear down the support structure and then wonder why everything collapses. I'd stopped returning his calls, stopped attending family dinners, stopped pretending that love and respect were the same thing. Victoria had kept trying to bridge the gap, but eventually, even she had given up. The last real conversation we'd had was 2 years ago, when she'd called to tell me she was engaged. "His name is Marcus," she'd said. "He's a financial advisor. Dad likes him." The implication was clear. "Unlike you, he's someone Dad can approve of." Now, looking at the wedding invitation, I wondered what kind of game this was. Was it a genuine attempt at reconciliation? Or was it Victoria's way of showing the world that she'd tried to heal the family, even if her brother was too stubborn to accept the olive branch? I picked up the invitation again and read the details. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 weeks from Saturday at St. Mary's Cathedral in White Plains. The reception would follow at the Westchester Country Club, the same club where my father had been a member for 20 years, where he'd played golf with judges and politicians, where he'd always insisted his connections were just as valuable as any law degree. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now I was the one with the real power, the one whose decisions could affect thousands of lives. But in my father's world, I was still just the kid who'd gotten too big for his britches. My phone buzzed. A text from my assistant. Reminder. Sentencing. Hearing for United States v. Richardson at 2 p.m. I looked at the clock. 1:30. I had a convicted embezzler to sentence. 3 pending motions to review and a stack of law clerk memos waiting for my signature. Real work. Important work. Work that mattered. I slipped the invitation into my desk drawer and stood up. Whatever Victoria's wedding represented, reconciliation, obligation, or just another opportunity for public humiliation, it would have to wait. I had a courtroom to run, justice to serve, and a reputation to maintain. But as I walked toward the courtroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that this invitation was more than just a wedding announcement. It was a test, a challenge, a final chance, to prove that I was either worthy of the family name or deserving of the exile I'd chosen. The weight of the gavel in my hand felt heavier than usual as I took my seat on the bench. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people going about their lives, each one carrying their own family stories, their own disappointments, their own difficult choices. 3 weeks. That's all the time I had to decide whether Judge Alexander Brennan was ready to face Thomas Brennan's son again. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing case files in my study. The number was unlisted, but I recognized the area code. Westchester County. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Alex." The voice was softer than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "Victoria. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I set down my pen and leaned back in my leather chair. Through the window of my Upper East Side apartment, the city lights twinkled like distant stars. "I got your invitation, and I'm still deciding." There was a pause. I could hear voices in the background. The clatter of dishes. She was probably at the family house, probably in the kitchen, where we'd spent countless hours as kids, sneaking cookies and planning elaborate schemes to avoid Dad's weekend work projects. "Mom's been asking about you," she said finally. Our mother, Catherine Brennan, had always been the diplomat in the family. She'd perfected the art of loving us both without taking sides, which somehow made her complicit in the silence. She'd send birthday cards with generic messages, Christmas gifts that were thoughtful but impersonal, always carefully neutral. "How is she? Tired? Worried? She keeps asking if you're eating enough, if you're taking care of yourself." I glanced. At the takeout containers on my counter, the evidence of too many nights working late and eating alone. "I'm fine. Are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Was I fine? I had everything I'd ever wanted professionally. Respect, influence, a lifetime appointment to one of the most prestigious courts in the country. But sitting in my expensive apartment, surrounded by law books and case files, I felt the familiar ache of isolation. "Tell me about Marcus," I said, changing the subject. Victoria's voice brightened. "He's wonderful, really. He gets along with everyone, even Dad. They talk about sports, business, and normal things. It's easy. The word stung more than it should have. I'd never been easy. Even as a kid, I'd asked too many questions, pushed too many boundaries, challenged too many assumptions. While other boys were playing catch with their fathers, I was in my room reading about Supreme Court cases. Dad's been different lately," Victoria continued. "Quieter, Marcus thinks. He misses you." I almost laughed. "Marcus has known him for what, 2 years? I've known him for 34. Trust me, he doesn't miss me. He misses the idea of me. That's not fair." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isn't it? When was the last time he called me? When was the last time he acknowledged my existence without it being a public embarrassment? Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The confirmation hearings were rough, but maybe if you'd just talked to him beforehand." Explain what? That I was doing my job. I was trying to serve my country. I'd worked 15 years to get to that point, and I wasn't going to let his small-town prejudices derail it. "He's not prejudiced, Alex. He's just traditional." Traditional. Another word that meant different things to different people. To Victoria, it meant family dinners and Sunday Mass and knowing your place in the world. To me, it had always felt like a cage, beautifully decorated but confining all the same. "I need to think about it," I said. "The wedding's in 2 weeks. It would mean a lot to me if you came. Whatever's between you and Dad, this is my day. Can't you put it aside for one afternoon?" That was the thing about Victoria. She'd always been able to make everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. She'd inherited our mother's gift for diplomacy. But she'd never understood that some conflicts couldn't be resolved with good intentions and forced smiles. "I'll let you know," I said after we hung up. I sat in the darkness of my study, thinking about family and obligation and the price of success. The federal courthouse was only a few miles away, but it felt like a different world. In that world, I was respected. My opinions mattered. My decisions carried weight, but in Westchester County, I was still just Thomas Brennan's disappointing son. The weekend passed in a blur of court documents and legal briefs. I had a major decision to write in a constitutional challenge to immigration law, a case that would likely end up before the Supreme Court, the kind of work that shaped the country's future. That would be studied in law schools for decades. On Monday morning, I called my tailor. Judge Brennan, Roberto Castellano, greeted me with the warmth reserved for longtime clients. "What can I do for you?" "I need a suit. Something formal, but not too formal." "Wedding appropriate?" Roberto raised an eyebrow. "Special occasion? Family?" "Wedding." "Ah," he nodded knowingly. "Family can be complicated." Roberto had been making suits for judges and lawyers for 30 years. He'd seen men armor themselves in fine wool and silk, preparing for battles that had nothing to do with courtrooms. "What kind of impression are you looking to make?" he asked. Considered the question. What kind of impression did I want to make? That I was successful, that I didn't need their approval, that I'd risen above their narrow expectations. "Professional," I said finally. "Respectful, but not apologetic." "I understand perfectly." While Roberto took measurements, I thought about the last time I'd worn a suit to a family function. My law school graduation, 8 years ago. My parents had attended, sitting in the back row of the auditorium while I received my diploma, magna cum laude. Afterward, at the reception, my father had shaken hands with my professors and classmates, playing the role of the proud parent, but later in the parking lot, he'd pulled me aside. "So what now?" he'd asked. "Now I take the bar exam. Then I start. Work at Morrison and Associates. And then I practice law. Maybe eventually become a judge." He'd looked at me like I'd told him I was planning to become an astronaut. You know what judges are, Alex? They're lawyers who couldn't make it in the real world. That conversation had haunted me through years of 18-hour days, through the brutal competition of big law firms, through the political minefield of judicial nomination. Every achievement felt like a response to that moment, proof that he'd been wrong. But what if proving him wrong wasn't the same as proving myself right? Roberto finished with the measurements and promised to have the suit ready by Friday. I walked back to the courthouse, past the vendors and tourists and protesters who gathered daily on the steps of justice. Inside, the marble halls echoed with the sound of footsteps and hushed conversations, the daily business of American democracy. My chambers felt like a sanctuary. Jennifer had left a stack of pending cases on my desk, each one a puzzle to be solved, a decision to be made. This was my world, orderly and rational, and governed by precedent and procedure. But as I sat down to work, I found myself thinking about white dresses and wedding cakes and the weight of family expectations, about the boy I'd been and the man I'd become and the distance between them. The RSVP card was still in my desk drawer, blank and waiting. 2 boxes to check, accepts with pleasure or regretfully declines. As if the complexity of family relationships could be reduced to a simple yes or no. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Dr. Sarah Chen, my old mentor from Columbia, now a professor. Emeritus who'd guided more judges through their careers than anyone else in the country. Alex, she answered on the second ring. How are you adjusting to the bench? Still learning? Listen, I was wondering if you had time for coffee this week. I could use some advice, of course. Personal or professional. I looked at the RSVP card on my desk. Both. We arranged to meet Wednesday afternoon at our usual spot, a quiet cafe near the law school where we'd had countless conversations over the years. Dr. Chen had a gift for seeing through surface problems to the deeper issues beneath. As I hung up, I realized I'd already made my decision. The question wasn't whether I should go to Victoria's wedding. The question was whether I was ready to face whatever came next. I picked up the RSVP card and checked the first box. Accepts with pleasure. The irony of the phrase wasn't lost on me. Pleasure was the last thing I expected from this reunion. But sometimes duty and love and the hope of reconciliation were enough to bridge the gap between what we want and what we need to do. I sealed the envelope and left it on Jennifer's desk for mailing. Whatever happened in 2 weeks, I would face it as Judge Alexander Brennan, with all the dignity and composure that title required, even if inside still felt like the boy who'd never quite measured up to his father's expectations. The train from Grand Central to White Plains had always been a journey backward in time. As the urban landscape gave way to manicured suburbs, I watched my reflection in the window and wondered if I looked as nervous as I felt. The new suit from Roberto fit perfectly, navy blue with subtle pinstripes that suggested authority without arrogance. Clothes, I'd learned, were just another form of armor. Dr. Chen's advice from our coffee meeting echoed in my mind. Sometimes the most judicial thing you can do is listen to evidence you don't want to hear. She'd been talking about more than just the wedding, of course. She'd been talking about forgiveness. Might have changed more than just me. The taxi dropped me off at the Westchester Country Club. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the ceremony wasn't until 4 o'clock, but I'd arrived early deliberately. I needed time to acclimate, to remember how to breathe in this rarefied air of old money and older grudges. The club hadn't changed. It's the same limestone facade, the same perfectly manicured grounds, the same sense of exclusivity that had always made me feel like an intruder even when my father's membership dues were current. I walked through the main entrance, past oil paintings of long dead members and trophy cases filled with golf tournament victories that meant everything to some people and nothing to me. Alexander. I turned to find Margaret Holbrook, Marcus's mother, approaching with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being watched. She was elegant in the way that money could buy perfect posture, perfect smile, perfectly coordinated outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mrs. Holbrook, Congratulations on Marcus's engagement. Thank you, dear. We're so thrilled about the wedding. Victoria is such a lovely girl. Her eyes swept over my suit with the practiced assessment of someone who knew quality when she saw it. You look wonderful. Very distinguished. Distinguished. The word carried weight in this crowd. It meant I'd climbed high enough to be worth acknowledging, even if my origins were questionable. I understand you're a federal judge now, she continued. How impressive. Thomas must be so proud. There it was, the assumption that my success would translate to family harmony. In Margaret Holbrook's world, achievement automatically led to approval. She couldn't imagine a parent who would view their child's success as a personal affront. Thank you, I said simply. There's no point in explaining the complexities of the Brennan family dynamics to someone who collected sons-in-law like golf trophies.
Oh.
There's your sister now. Victoria emerged from the bridal suite, looking like something from a fairy tale. The dress was classic, elegant lace, modest neckline. It's the kind of timeless design that would look perfect in photographs 50 years from now. But it was her face that stopped me. It was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or professional styling. She was genuinely happy. For a moment, I forgot about family drama and old wounds. This was my little sister, the girl who used to practice wedding ceremonies with her dolls in our backyard, who'd made me promise to walk her down the aisle if Dad ever wasn't available. Now she was actually getting married, and despite everything, I was here to witness it. Alex. She rushed toward me, careful not to trip on her train. You came. You actually came. Of course I came. You're my sister. She hugged me carefully, mindful of her dress and makeup, but the emotion was real. I was so afraid you'd change your mind, especially after ... After what? Her expression faltered slightly. Dad's been difficult about the guest list, about you being here. Before I could respond, a familiar voice cut through the ambient chatter of wedding preparations. Well, look what the cat dragged in, Uncle. Patrick Brennan stood near the bar, his face already flushed with the kind of ruddy color that came from starting the celebration early. My father's younger brother had always been the family's designated provocateur, the one who said the things everyone else was thinking but too polite to voice. Patrick. I nodded toward him. Judge Brennan, he said, making my title sound like an insult. Fancy seeing you here. Thought you were too important for family gatherings these days. Victoria tensed beside me. Uncle Patrick, please. Not today. I'm just saying hello to my nephew. Can a man say hello? Took a swig from his beer bottle. Tell me, Alex, what's it like sitting up there in your ivory tower looking down on us regular folks? The old anger flared in my chest, the same rage that had driven me through law school and judicial clerkships and confirmation hearings. But 8 years of legal practice had taught me something valuable. Never engage with hostile witnesses when you don't have to. It's good to see you too, Patrick, he grunted, and wandered back toward the bar, muttering something about uppity college boys. Victoria watched him go with obvious embarrassment. I'm sorry about that. He's been drinking since noon. It's fine. Where are Mom and Dad? Dad's outside with Marcus and the groomsmen, taking photos. Mom's ... double quotes. Victoria glanced around nervously. She's somewhere around here. She's excited to see you, but she's also worried about how Dad will react. I followed her gaze across the room and spotted our mother near the entrance, greeting arriving guests with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades as a contractor's wife. Catherine Brennan had always been beautiful, but now she looked older, more fragile somehow. The years of maintaining peace in a divided family had taken their toll, as if sensing my attention. She looked up and her eyes met across the room. Her face lit up with a mixture of joy and relief that made my chest tight. She started toward us, but was intercepted by a group of relatives who wanted to discuss seating arrangements. She's been planning this for months, Victoria said, following my gaze. Every detail perfect, every possible conflict anticipated and managed. She's terrified something will go wrong. Something like me showing up, something like Dad making a scene. Before I could ask what she meant, the club's wedding coordinator appeared with a clipboard and the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested we were behind schedule. Miss Brennan, we need to start the processional in 10 minutes. You ready? Victoria took a deep breath. Ready as I'll ever be. The coordinator hurried away, speaking rapidly into her headset. Victoria turned to me, suddenly looking very young, despite the elegant dress and professional makeup. Alex, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest, okay? Did you really come? I mean, I'm glad you're here, but given everything that's happened, why now? It was a fair question. I've been asking myself the same thing for 2 weeks. Was it love for my sister? Curiosity about how much the family had? Changed? Some misguided hope that 8 years had been enough time to heal old wounds? Because you're my sister, I said finally. Because some things matter more than pride. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. I hope Dad feels the same way. Through the tall windows that overlooked the club's terrace, I could see the groomsmen. Gathered around Marcus, all of them young and successful and comfortable in their expensive suits, and there at the center of the group was my father. Thomas Brennan looked older than I remembered, his hair more gray than brown now, his shoulders slightly stooped. He still commanded attention, still drew people into his orbit with that combination of charisma and certainty that had made him successful in business. He was telling some story that had the other men laughing, gesturing with his hands the way he always did when he was holding court. For a moment, watching him through the glass, I remembered being 10 years old and thinking my father was the smartest, strongest man in the world. He'd seemed capable of anything back then. Building houses, fixing cars, solving problems that seemed impossible to everyone else. I'd wanted nothing more than his approval, his respect, his pride in me. When has that changed? When did his approval become conditional on my conformity? When did love become contingent on meeting his narrow definition of success? I should go check on the flowers, Victoria said, but she didn't move. She was watching me watch our father, probably seeing the same memories play across my face. He's proud of you, you know, she said quietly. He just doesn't know how to show it. I wanted to believe her. Part of me still wanted to believe that underneath all the anger and disappointment and public humiliation, there was still the father who'd taught me to throw a baseball and helped me with my homework and told me I could be anything I wanted. When I grew up, but wanting something and believing it were two different things. And after 8 years of silence, hope felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The wedding coordinator reappeared, more urgent now. Miss Brennan, we really must begin. Victoria squeezed my hand. Wish me luck. You need Marcus to realize how fortunate he is. She kissed my cheek and hurried toward the staging area where her bridesmaids were waiting. I watched her go. This woman who'd somehow managed to remain innocent despite growing up in the same house. That had turned me into a cynic. Through the window, I saw my father glance toward the building. For a split second, our eyes met through the glass. His expression didn't change, but I saw him stiffen slightly, his shoulders squaring as if preparing. For battle, 8 years of silence were about to end. I just wasn't sure yet whether it would be with words or warfare. The ceremony was flawless. Victoria walked down the aisle on our father's arm, radiant and perfect. While I watched from the third row, close enough to matter, far enough to avoid, immediate conflict. Dad had chosen his spot carefully during the processional, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Never once acknowledging my presence, the reception began with all the orchestrated joy that money could buy. Crystal glasses clinked, a string quartet played tasteful classics, and conversations flowed with the easy rhythm of people who belonged. I found myself at table 7, strategically placed between Marcus's college friends and some distant cousins. I barely recognized the speeches started after the main course. Marcus's best man told charming stories about college adventures. Victoria's maid of honor recounted their friendship with touching sincerity. Then the microphone was passed to my father. Thomas Brennan stood with the confidence of a man accustomed. 2 holding rooms. His toast began predictably, praise for Victoria's beauty, welcome to Marcus, gratitude to the assembled guests. But then his eyes found mine across the room. Family, he said, his voice carrying easily across the reception hall, is about more than blood. It's about loyalty. It's about showing up when it matters, not just when it's convenient. The words hit like a physical blow. Around me, conversations quieted as people began to sense undercurrents they didn't understand. Some people, Dad continued, his gaze never leaving my face, think success means forgetting where you came from. Think a fancy title makes you better than the people who raised you. My mother's face had gone pale. Victoria looked stricken, her hand reaching for Marcus's arm. But Dad wasn't finished. I built this family with my own hands. Honest work, honest values. And I'm proud to welcome Marcus into it, a man who understands what loyalty means, what family means. He raised his glass to Marcus and Victoria. May they never forget what matters most. The applause was scattered, uncertain. People weren't sure what they'd witnessed, but they knew it wasn't entirely celebratory. I sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, whispered speculation already beginning. This was the moment I could have walked away, should have walked away. Let Dad have his victory, his final word, his public declaration that I was unwelcome. In my own family, instead, I stood up. The room fell silent. Not the polite quiet of attentive guests, but the electric silence of anticipation, of collective breath held, waiting for explosion or surrender. Thomas, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned in countless courtrooms. You're right about family being more than blood. I moved away from my table, walking slowly toward the head table where my father stood frozen, microphone still in his hand. Family is about showing up. It's about loyalty. It's about supporting each other through difficult times. I stopped. About 10 feet from him, close enough that everyone could see us both clearly. It's also about forgiveness, about recognizing when pride has become more important than love. Dad's jaw tightened. You think you can come here after 8 years and lecture me about family? I think I can come here and tell the truth. I turned slightly, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on him. 8 years ago, my father gave an interview to the local newspaper during my confirmation hearings for the federal bench when political opponents were trying to destroy my reputation. My own father publicly questioned my fitness to serve. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a public reckoning. That interview nearly cost me everything I'd worked 15 years to achieve. It's not because of its truth, but because of its timing. Because sometimes betrayal hurts most when it comes from the people who are supposed to protect you. Dad's face flushed red. You chose your career over your family. I chose my calling over your approval. The words came out harder than I'd intended. 8 years of suppressed anger finally finding a voice. I chose to serve my country instead of building houses. I chose justice over construction contracts. You chose to become a disgrace. Word hung in the air like a curse. In the silence that followed, I could hear my mother crying softly, could see Victoria's devastated face, and could feel the shocked attention of every person in the room. And then, from the back corner of the reception hall, someone stood up. Judge Harold Morrison, retired Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. I'd argued before him twice as a young attorney, had been honored when he'd attended my swearing-in ceremony. He was 83 years old, white-haired and dignified, and he was walking toward us with purpose. Thomas Brennan, Judge Morrison, said, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. You are speaking to the Honorable Judge Alexander Brennan, one of the finest legal minds of his generation, and a credit to the federal judiciary. Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. Judge Morrison continued walking until he stood directly in front of me. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he straightened to attention and rendered a crisp, formal bow, a salute, but the deep bow of respect that judges showed to one another in ceremonial proceedings. Your Honor, he said formally, it has been my privilege to watch your career, your integrity, and your service to justice. This nation is fortunate to have you on the bench. The effect was electric. Table 4, District Attorney Rebecca Santos stood and bowed. At Table 12, Congresswoman Maria Rodriguez rose from her seat and nodded with solemn respect. Around the room, others followed, lawyers, judges, politicians, business leaders who understood exactly what they were witnessing. My father stood frozen, microphone hanging loose in his hand, as the most powerful people in the room paid homage to the son he'd just called a disgrace. Judge Morrison turned to Dad, his voice gentle but firm. Your son doesn't just interpret law, Mr. Brennan. He shapes it. His decisions affect millions of lives. He sits on the federal bench because he's earned it through excellence, integrity, and devotion to justice. Dad's face had gone ashen. The room, the continuing display of respect was impossible to ignore or dismiss. These weren't people offering polite courtesy. They were acknowledging genuine achievement, real power, deserved honor. Dad started, then stopped. For the first time in my memory, Thomas Brennan was speechless. Judge Morrison handed me his business card. Your Honor, I hope you'll consider speaking at our judicial conference next month. The theme is justice and family, quite fitting, I think. As the formal recognition concluded, and people began returning to their seats, Dad and I stood facing each other across 8 years of silence and accumulated hurt. The anger was still there, the pride, the fundamental difference in how we saw the world. But something else was there, to a recognition that maybe, just maybe, we'd both been wrong about some things. Alexander, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Dad, we stood there for a long moment, neither advancing nor retreating, while around us the reception slowly resumed its celebration. Victoria was crying openly. Now, but they were tears of relief, rather than devastation. Your sister's wedding? Dad said finally. Yeah, her wedding. He handed me the microphone. Maybe you should give a proper toast. To the bride. I took it, surprised by the weight of the simple gesture. Around the room, conversations died as people realized the moment wasn't over. To Victoria, I said, looking at my sister's tear-streaked but radiant face, who never stopped believing that family could be more than our worst moments, who never stopped hoping that love could be stronger than pride. I raised the glass I'd barely touched all evening. To Victoria and Marcus, may you build something beautiful together. The applause this time was genuine, warm, and relieved. As I handed the microphone back to Dad, our eyes met briefly. We have a lot to talk about, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. We do. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was recognition that we were both more complex than our worst moments, that 8 years of silence had cost us both something valuable, that maybe it was time to stop letting pride make our choices for us. As the evening wound down, and guests began departing, I found myself standing on the club's terrace, looking out over the manicured grounds where I'd played as a child during countless family events. The boy who'd run across these lawns had dreamed of making his father proud. The man I'd become had learned that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that left everyone changed. Tomorrow, there would be difficult conversations, tentative steps toward understanding, the slow work of rebuilding what pride had torn down. Tonight, though, I was simply a brother who'd watched his sister marry the man she loved, in a room full of people who finally understood who I really was. That felt like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.